I took my son in when I was 39 after 3 miscarriages tore holes in my heart I thought would never heal. He wasn't born from me, but he became my whole life. I worked night shifts as a nurse, skipped holidays, sold my wedding ring just to help him start over when he went broke at 27. And yet, on the day of his funeral, his wife didn't mention my name once. 2 hours later, she told me I was the reason he died. Then she changed the locks and threw my memories out like trash. You think you've hit rock bottom until your whole existence gets erased by someone who married into it? Stay with me till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. When my son died, my daughter-in-law said, "Don't be dramatic, pack your bags and learn to survive." I was still wearing black from the funeral when she looked me dead in the eye and said those words like she was reading off a grocery list. I thought maybe she was in shock, grieving, confused. But when I went to the kitchen later that night and found the fridge padlocked, the electricity to my room shut off, and my clothes stuffed into a trash bag by the front door, I realized she meant every word. Carlton had been gone for 3 days. I had barely washed my face, let alone eaten. His cologne still hung in the hallway like the memory of his last hug, soft and sudden. He was all I had. After all the years, all the nights working double shifts to keep food on the table and gas in the car so he could make it to school on time. He never once complained. Not even when his back pain got worse. Not even when the stress of holding his marriage together started to take his light away. That same night, I tried to use the washer. She had unplugged it and left a sticky note that read, "This isn't your home anymore." I found myself whispering to no one Carlton would never let this happen. But he was gone, and what was left of him, his photos, his scent, his place in this house, was being erased with each petty act. That house didn't just lose its son. It lost its soul. The next morning, I overheard her on the phone telling someone I had driven Carlton to exhaustion. That I was overbearing. That he died trying to escape the weight of me. I don't know if that lie was for her benefit or if she really believed it. But I stood behind the hallway wall, clutching my son's scarf to my chest, and for the first time since the funeral, I screamed. Not out loud. Just inside. Quiet, sharp, and deep enough to tear something that will never heal. I spent the following day sitting in the garden Carlton planted for me 2 summers ago. I sat on the bench he built himself, the one with my name carved under the armrest. It was warm, but I shivered. I watched the way the wind moved through the lilies, and all I could think was how cruel it was that beauty still dared to exist when he did not. By dusk, she handed me a manila envelope. Inside were papers, some legal, some scribbled notes detailing that Carlton had no living will, no assets in my name, nothing that made my presence here valid in her eyes. She said the house was hers now, that I could take my things and leave. I asked her if I could stay until Sunday. She said she'd call the police if I wasn't gone by morning. So that night I packed slowly. Not because I had much to gather, but because I couldn't make my hands move. Every item I picked up reminded me of something. The blanket Carlton gave me after his first paycheck. The mug he made in elementary school. The slippers he used to tease me for wearing in summer. I folded them carefully and placed them in a single duffel bag. As I zipped it up, I realized I had no destination. No plan. Just the bruised echo of my son's laughter and a house that no longer had room for me. I stepped outside just before midnight. The air was cold and the stars refused to shine. I stood on the porch, looking at the front door one last time, half expecting Carlton to open it and say he was sorry. But there was only silence. I didn't cry as I walked down the steps. I didn't cry when the door shut behind me. But when I reached the sidewalk and looked back, I saw the porch light flicker off. That's when the tears came. Not like a flood. More like rain after a long drought. slow, quiet, and impossible to stop. And that was the second worst thing to happen to me that week. The first, of course, was losing my son. But this was the moment I realized I had lost whatever pieces of him this world still had left. I was 39 when I became a mother, but not in the way I always imagined. After 3 miscarriages, I stopped counting the weeks. I stopped looking at baby shoes in store windows. I stopped praying the way I used to with hope in one hand and a name in the other. And then Carlton came into my life. He was 7, with eyes too old for his face and a silence too deep for his age. The foster agency told me he didn't like to be hugged, didn't speak much, and struggled with trust. But I knew the moment I saw him clutching a worn-out backpack and standing too straight for someone so small that he was mine. Not by birth, but by heart. And sometimes that kind of bond roots deeper. Being his mother wasn't instant. It was built in pieces night by night. I worked the night shift at the hospital changing IV bags and calming patients in the dark while leaving sticky notes on our fridge for him. Notes like, "Don't forget breakfast," "Love you more than pancakes," or "Just breathe today, sweet boy." And every morning when I came home, I'd find those notes folded on the table, his name scribbled on the back in shaky block letters. I didn't have much, but whatever I did, I gave to him. He had braces before I had a new winter coat. I bought him a laptop with the savings meant for my car. I skipped birthdays for overtime, so his school trips were covered. Every time someone reminded me that he wasn't really mine, I just smiled. Blood never made me a mother. Sacrifice did. When Carlton got older, he started calling me Mama C. Said it made me sound tough. I liked that. I had to be tough. When he turned 16, he wanted a suit for his first debate meet. I pawned the last ring my grandmother left me. He won 3rd place and held that plastic trophy like it was solid gold. That night, he asked me how I learned to love someone who came from someone else's body. I told him love doesn't check birth certificates. He was 27 when the market crashed and his startup went under. I found him sitting in the dark the same way I used to find him as a child. I didn't ask questions. I just opened the shoebox where I kept the few pieces of jewelry I hadn't sold over the years. He tried to refuse, but I put the box in his lap and kissed his forehead. I said, "This is what mothers do. We break open to build you back." He promised to pay me back. I never cared. Seeing him smile again was enough. He started over with less pride, but more heart, and I stood behind him like always cheering him on from the shadows. That's where mothers belong most of the time. Not in the spotlight, but in the steady background clapping when no one else is looking. Even when he got married, I stayed out of their way. I wanted him to build a life that was his. I never expected him to choose between us. I thought there was enough room for both love and loyalty. But now looking back, maybe I was too quiet. Maybe I should have spoken louder. Maybe love made me blind to warning signs. Still, I don't regret a thing. Carlton gave me the title I thought I'd never earn mom. And even if the world forgot, that even if his wife tried to erase me from his story, I remember every chapter. Every scraped knee. Every graduation speech. Every night he called just to say he was okay. Those memories are mine. They can't be taken. They're carved into the very bones of who I am. I raised him alone. Not perfectly, but with every ounce of love I had. And I would do it again, heartbreak and all. Because in those years, I wasn't just a mother. I was his home. It didn't happen all at once. The distance between Cleo and me grew in slow, deliberate inches. First, it was the thermostat. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, shivering only to find the heat turned down to 60. I thought maybe she forgot Or maybe Carlton had changed it. But then the Wi-Fi password stopped working. And when I asked, she laughed and said she must have accidentally reset it. Then came the groceries. She started buying almond milk, even though she knew I was allergic. I'd open the fridge and find nothing I could eat. No yogurt. No apples. No crackers. Just unfamiliar brands and things I'd never touched. I told myself not to make a fuss. I didn't want Carlton to feel caught in the middle, but deep down I felt it. That small, sharp pull that told me I wasn't welcome. Still, I smiled. I folded laundry. I made sure dinner was hot when they came home. I offered to watch the dog when they went out. I told myself she'd warm up, that maybe she just needed time. But time passed and her tolerance for me only thinned. One afternoon, I heard her telling a friend on the phone that I was always lurking around. She said I was acting like the house was mine, that I needed to remember my place. I stood there just outside the door holding a basket of clean towels. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I let her words sink in like water into cloth. After that, the comments became more direct. She told me I was interrupting their newlywed rhythm. She said things like it must be hard not having a life of your own. Or you've raised your son. Let him go. Sometimes she said it with a smile. That was the worst part. The cruelty wrapped in sugar. I tried to talk to Carlton, but every time I brought it up, he changed the subject. He'd tell me work was draining him, or that Cleo was under pressure to get pregnant. When she finally announced she was expecting, he lit up like a child. He said it was a miracle, that everything was going to be okay now. So I stayed quiet. I didn't want to ruin his joy, even if it meant shrinking myself into smaller and smaller corners of the house. I stopped watching TV in the living room. I tiptoed around in the mornings. I even started doing my laundry after midnight so I wouldn't disturb the flow. I convinced myself that was love, that mothers made themselves small for their children to stand tall. But something didn't feel right. Cleo never looked sick. She never acted tired. She drank wine at dinner once and laughed it off as a slip. And then 2 months in, I found a receipt in the trash for a pregnancy belly prop. A silicone one, the kind used for costume shoots or acting roles. My hands trembled when I picked it up. I felt something fracture inside me like a bone you thought had healed suddenly snapping again. I didn't confront her. I didn't say a word. I just watched. I watched as Carlton rubbed her stomach, as she pretended to yawn with fake nausea, as she Googled baby names out loud and asked if I preferred Hudson or Elliot. I said nothing. Because what could I say? I knew the truth, but I also knew he wouldn't believe me. And that broke me more than the lie itself. That he would stand beside someone who crafted a fantasy rather than hear the quiet truth from the woman who raised him. The woman who sat by his hospital bed when he broke his leg. The woman who read him bedtime stories until he was 10 and pretended not to notice when he kept listening until 12. I started to feel like a ghost in my own life, floating room to room unseen, only noticed when I was in the way. The air in the house got heavier like grief with no body. I began avoiding the mirror. I didn't recognize the tired face staring back. The day Cleo told me point blank that I was the reason their marriage was strained, I didn't argue. She said I had no boundaries, that I had raised a man who couldn't detach, that her baby, yes, still clinging to that word, deserved a life without my shadow over it. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't have the strength to fight someone who wore deception like perfume. Carlton said nothing. He stood behind her quiet eyes on the floor. That silence hurt worse than 1,000 insults. It was the sound of a door closing slowly forever, And so the cracks became canyons. The small things weren't small anymore. They were warnings. Warnings I didn't want to believe, because believing them meant admitting I was losing him. Not to death, but to someone who knew how to push me out without ever laying a finger. And the saddest part, I let her. I let her make me disappear. Because I loved him more than I loved being right. The chapel smelled like lilies and polished wood. I clutched the handkerchief Carlton gave me years ago, the one with my initials stitched in crooked thread. But when I walked in, no one looked at me. Not Cleo. Not her family. Not even the usher who barely glanced at the list before pointing me to the back row. I sat there behind cousins I'd never met and neighbors who didn't know how many times I had stayed up nights to rub Carlton's fevered back. Behind people who smiled politely but didn't recognize me. I had worn black before, but never like this. This wasn't mourning. This was erasure. At the front of the room stood a large photo of Carlton. It was one of him and Cleo laughing at some beach I'd never seen. His arm around her, her hand on his chest. There were no childhood pictures, no mother and son memories, no sign that I had ever been part of the life they were now celebrating. The minister spoke about Carlton's generosity, his hard work, his love for family, but never once did the word mother leave his lips. I wasn't even a footnote in the story. I was a ghost who had slipped through the cracks of his life. When it came time for tributes, Cleo stood first. Her voice trembled just enough to be convincing. She spoke about how Carlton had been her anchor, her protector, the love of her life. She spoke of dreams they had made and the child they would never raise. She cried in the way people do when they want an audience to grieve with them. One by one, her friends followed. Each story felt curated, rehearsed, perfectly packaged for the room. No one mentioned his childhood. No one mentioned the boy who once stayed up all night helping me fix a broken radiator. Or the young man who used to surprise me with daffodils because he knew I hated roses. I waited, heart pounding, hoping someone would say my name. Just once. Even in passing. I waited for Cleo to invite me up to give me one moment to say goodbye. But when the final speaker stepped down and the piano began to play, I realized it wasn't going to happen. They were burying my son, and I wasn't allowed to speak. I sat frozen hands, clenched in my lap nails, digging into my palms. My grief had nowhere to go. It stayed locked inside, hot and trembling. Every breath I took felt borrowed. Every tear I held back was a scream I couldn't release. At the end of the service, people lined up to place flowers on the casket. I waited until the very end, until most had left. I walked up slowly, heels clicking against the floor like echoes in a cathedral. I laid down a single white rose. Carlton once told me that white meant truth. It was the only thing I could give him now. As I stood there, I whispered the goodbye no one let me say out loud. Then I turned and walked back down the aisle, past the faces that didn't see me. Past the pews where I had not belonged. Past the picture that showed a man with no mother. And that was the moment I realized I wasn't just grieving my son. I was grieving the part of me that had been stripped away piece by piece until even my sorrow wasn't allowed a seat in the room. The sky was already dark when I returned from the funeral. The clouds had opened up on the drive back and everything outside looked soaked in cold. I stepped onto the porch and immediately noticed something was wrong. The key wouldn't turn. I tried again thinking maybe my hands were shaking too much. But no. The lock had been changed. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, this time harder, my breath fogging up in the cold. Still nothing. Then I saw it. My suitcase. The one Carlton bought me before his wedding. It was sitting in the middle of the front lawn, soaked straight through. Next to it, a cardboard box crumpled in the rain. Inside were my clothes photo frames and the letters Carlton had written me over the years. The ink was already running. I bent down trying to shield the box with my body, but it was no use. The water had seeped through everything. The picture of Carlton holding my hand at his graduation was stuck to a wet envelope. The corner tore off in my hand. I stood up and looked at the house. The lights were on. Someone was in there. But the door stayed closed. Then Cleo opened the upstairs window. She didn't say my name, just stared for a long moment before telling me this wasn't my home anymore. She said Carlton hadn't left anything to me. No will, no provision, no legal right. According to her, I had no place here. Not anymore. I asked her if I could come in. Just for a moment, just to dry the letters. She shook her head. Told me if I didn't leave, she would call the police. Said she'd give me 10 minutes before she did. So I gathered what I could. Wet clothes, warped photographs, my slippers that had been tossed into the bushes. I held them close, trying to keep them from falling apart, even though I was already falling apart myself. There was no yelling, no scene, just the quiet sound of rain and the hollow thud of my footsteps as I walked away. Each step felt like I was leaving more than a house. I was leaving the last place where Carlton's laughter had lived. The walls that once echoed with his voice. The space where I cooked his favorite soup and folded his laundry while he told me about his day. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was afraid if I did, I might run to the door and beg. And I couldn't do that. Not when I knew he would never have wanted this. But death is a thief and grief turns people into strangers. By the time I reached the street, I was soaked through. My suitcase was dragging mud. My heart was dragging silence. I sat down on the curb, clutching the only dry thing I had left, one letter from Carlton that had somehow stayed tucked inside my coat. I didn't read it. I just held it, because it was the only proof I had that I still mattered in his story. That night, I slept in the back seat of my car. I used my coat as a blanket and my memory as a pillow. And I tried to tell myself this wasn't the end. But it felt like it. It felt like I had been written out of my son's life, and now even the pages were being torn away. The parking lot behind St. Agnes Church wasn't made for sleeping, but it was quiet and mostly empty at night. I backed my car into the farthest corner beneath a flickering light that buzzed when the wind blew hard. From there, if I leaned just right, I could see the glow from Carlton's old bedroom window. It didn't look any different. Same yellow curtains. Same dim glow. I used to peek in from the hallway just to make sure he was sleeping. Now I watched from the cold front seat of my car, wondering if that light even remembered me. The nights were long. I curled up under my coat, using the side of the seat as a pillow. The fabric was rough, and the seatbelt buckle always dug into my ribs. Still, I preferred the pain. It reminded me I was still here. I kept my things in a grocery bag beside me. A few clothes. The letter from Carlton. A small flashlight I bought from a gas station with the last $5 in my pocket. I rationed my snacks half a granola bar at a time. Water came from the spout behind the church garden. I told myself it was temporary. Just a pause. Not the end. Each night I counted the cars that passed on the road nearby. It helped keep my mind busy. Some nights I counted stars instead. When the sky was clear, they looked like holes punched into black paper. Like someone somewhere could see through and maybe, just maybe, was watching over me. Around the fourth night, I started to cough. Just a little at first. Then more. By morning, I couldn't stop shivering. I wrapped a towel around my shoulders and pretended it helped. It didn't. That's when Father Tom found me. I didn't hear him approach. I just looked up, and there he was standing a few feet from the driver's side window holding a brown paper bag. He didn't say anything, just nodded and set the bag down on the hood before walking away. Inside was a loaf of bread, 2 hard-boiled eggs, and a small bottle of orange juice. I ate slowly, trying not to cry. He didn't ask me what happened, and I was grateful for that, because I didn't know how to tell the story without falling apart. The next night, he left a blanket. The night after that, a small bottle of cough syrup. No words, just quiet gifts from someone who saw me without making me feel seen in the wrong way. I thought about calling someone, an old friend, a coworker, but shame is loud. It speaks over logic. I didn't want to explain why I had nowhere to go, why my son was gone, why the house I once called home had locked me out like a stranger. So I stayed. I watched the days stretch. I marked time by church bells and trash pickups. I kept Carlton's letter in my pocket like a secret. I read it once when I couldn't sleep. Just a few lines about how proud he was, how he knew I'd always be there for him. I pressed my fingers against the ink, hoping it would sink into my skin. It never felt like real sleep, just moments of quiet before the cold woke me again. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch your body, but your soul. I stopped checking the time. I stopped checking the mirror. There was no one to impress, no one to notice. But each night before I closed my eyes, I looked toward that window. That soft light that once meant warmth, comfort, life. And I whispered the same thing. Not a prayer, just a thought. One sentence. I'm still here. The phone rang just after sunrise. I was sitting in my car, trying to ignore the stiffness in my back and the soreness in my throat. The screen showed an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. He said his name was David Klein and that he was Carlton's attorney. I didn't believe him. I hadn't heard of any lawyer. Cleo never mentioned one. And after everything she had done, I didn't expect any loose ends. He said Carlton had left some paperwork. A letter. Something he wanted me to have. I asked him how he got my number. He told me it was on a contact sheet Carlton had filled out months ago. I still didn't believe it. I told him I had nothing left, that I didn't know why he was calling me now, that it might be a mistake. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. But he stayed calm. He said the envelope had my name written in Carlton's handwriting, said there were instructions, that if I wanted to come in, I should do so within the week. I didn't say yes right away. I just sat there holding the phone, listening to the silence after he hung up. My hands were trembling. I didn't know if it was the cold or the hope that had crept in when I wasn't looking. The next day, I stood outside the law office for almost 20 minutes. It was a narrow building with a glass door and gold letters that spelled out Klein and Associates. I kept staring at my reflection, wondering what I looked like to strangers. A tired woman with no place to be. I told myself I would just walk in, hear him out, and leave. I didn't want anything. I wasn't expecting anything. I just needed to understand why Carlton had written my name. Why this man had called me like I still mattered. Inside the office smelled like paper and coffee. The receptionist gave me a polite smile, like she hadn't seen the pain I carried in with me. I told her who I was, and she nodded like she'd been expecting me. Mr. Klein came out a few minutes later. He looked young. Too young to be the person holding the last thread of my son's voice. But his eyes were kind. He didn't shake my hand, just gestured toward the back office and waited while I followed. Every step down that hallway felt like walking toward something I couldn't name. I was scared. Not of bad news. I already had the worst. I was scared of feeling something again, of remembering who I used to be before everything fell apart. When we sat down, he opened a folder and slid an envelope across the table. It was plain. No return address. Just my name, written in Carlton's familiar handwriting. A little slanted, a little rushed, but undeniably his. I didn't touch it right away. I just stared at it, like it might vanish if I blinked. That's when I felt it. That small flicker. The thing I thought I had lost in the cold of the car and the silence of the grave. Hope, hope. Quiet, hesitant, but real. It sat with me in that room as I reached for the envelope, as I let my fingers graze the ink, as I braced myself for whatever came next. Mr. Klein waited for me to open the envelope. I sat there staring at my name in Carlton's handwriting, still not ready to believe this was real. My fingers moved slowly, almost afraid that the paper inside would disappear if I opened it too fast. The letter was folded once. The creases were sharp. I unfolded it, hands trembling, and read the first line out loud in my head. It was him. His voice. I could hear it in every word. He said he wrote it after a fire in a rental property he had been inspecting. He'd gotten out just in time, but the experience had shaken him. It made him think about what would happen if he didn't make it home one day. He said he wanted to make things right, that he knew Cleo had been lying, that she had fooled him for too long. But not anymore. He wrote that everything he owned his shares in the company, the house, the accounts would go to me. That he had changed the documents and filed them properly because he didn't want Cleo getting anything she hadn't earned. He said he had seen her true face when he was at his lowest. And in contrast, he saw mine too. Still there. Still steady. I started to cry, but I held the letter tighter instead of wiping the tears away. I didn't want to let go. Every word was like a warm hand reaching across time and loss and pulling me back to the boy I once rocked to sleep. He ended the letter with one sentence. Just a line. But it undid me completely. You were the only person who stood by me when I had nothing. I had waited so long to feel seen, to be remembered, to know that the love I gave, the sacrifices I made, were not invisible. And there it was, written in his hand, sealed by his choice. Mr. Klein slid another document across the desk. It was the official will. Stamped, signed, witnessed. All legal. All binding. My name appeared again. Not as a footnote. Not as a courtesy. As the sole beneficiary. I put my hand over the paper, not to claim it, but to steady myself. I didn't want the money. I didn't care about the house. I cared that he had known, even if he never said it to my face. Even if he let Cleo push me into the shadows while he was alive. He knew who I was to him. He remembered. For the first time in weeks, I felt something inside me shift. The numbness cracked. The grief didn't leave, but it no longer stood alone. It was joined by a sense of being held, by a whisper that said I hadn't imagined our bond. I looked up at Mr. Klein and tried to speak, but the words came out broken. He just nodded, told me there would be more paperwork to sign, that we'd take things step by step. But for now, he said Carlton's last wishes were clear. And that was enough. That was everything. We pulled up to the house just before noon. The driveway was packed with cars, and there were folding chairs set up on the lawn. A banner hung from the front porch printed with Carlton's face and the words in loving memory. I recognized the font. Cleo never missed a chance to turn grief into an event. Inside, people were milling around with paper plates, sipping lemonade, nodding at each other like they understood loss. At the center of it all stood Cleo in a white dress holding a microphone connected to her phone. She was live streaming to some donation page, talking about legacy hardship carrying on Carlton's dream. I wondered if she rehearsed those words in the mirror. I didn't say anything when I walked in. Neither did Mr. Klein. He just handed me the envelope with the court documents and stepped aside. I waited until she saw me, until her smile dropped just enough to show she was nervous. She asked what I was doing there. I told her I was here to reclaim what was mine. I said it softly. No anger, no performance, just truth. She laughed, loud and forced. Tried to play it off for the audience still watching. She said I was confused. That grief made people do strange things. That I needed help. I handed her the folder. She glanced at it, then tossed it on a nearby table. Said it was fake. That Carlton would never leave her with nothing. That this was just another attempt to drag his name through the mud. Mr. Klein stepped forward then. Calm and firm. He explained the contents. The notarized will. The signatures. The date filed 3 months before Carlton passed. He showed the witnesses' statements. The official seal. Cleo's face changed. She tried yelling then, claimed it was forged, said we were lying. She grabbed her phone and started filming again, shouting about fraud and theft. That's when the officers arrived. Apparently, someone had already called them. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe someone watching the live stream. They asked what was happening. Cleo pointed at us, demanding they arrest me. Mr. Klein handed them the documents. They stepped outside to review everything. It took 15 minutes. I stood by the fireplace looking at the picture of Carlton she had blown up and framed. He looked tired in that photo, like he had already started pulling away. When the officers came back in, they didn't speak to me. They went straight to Cleo, told her the will was valid, told her she had 24 hours to vacate the property, that any attempt to block access could lead to legal consequences. She screamed, said it wasn't fair, that she had plans, that this house was her home. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked outside. The wind felt different, lighter somehow, like something had been lifted off the air. I looked up at the window of Carlton's old room. The curtain moved slightly, and I wondered if he'd be proud. If this was the ending he had hoped for when he signed that paper. Mr. Klein caught up to me, asked if I was okay. I told him I didn't come for revenge. I came to finish what my son started, to make sure his wishes were honored. Behind us, Cleo's voice was still echoing through the open door, but it no longer had power. Not over me, not over this home. Justice didn't need an audience. It just needed to be done. Quietly. Finally. Completely. I could have told her to leave right then. I had every right. The law was on my side, and so was the truth. But standing there in the house that had held so much pain, I found no satisfaction in pushing her out with force. She stood frozen in the doorway, eyes still wet with fury, waiting for me to strike back. Instead, I looked at her and said the only thing I needed to. Carlton once loved you. For that, I'll give you 2 days. Quiet ones. No scenes, no more stories. Just leave. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said enough. She wasn't used to mercy. Not from me. Not from anyone who had lost so much because of her. I spent that night in Carlton's old room. Not to reclaim it, but to remember it. The posters he taped to the wall were gone. The bed was different. But I could still feel the weight of his childhood in the air, tucked into the corners. I sat on the edge of the mattress and closed my eyes, letting every memory move through me like a slow, heavy wave. In the morning, I made coffee in silence. I watched the light shift through the kitchen window and land on the countertop the same way it used to when I cooked breakfast while he rushed to find his shoes. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. By the second day, Cleo had packed. There were no words exchanged between us. Just a nod when she passed me in the hallway carrying the last box. That was enough. I watched her car pull away from the driveway without waving. Not out of spite. Just peace. Then I walked through the house one last time, room by room. Not to take inventory, but to let go. I touched the walls, not to claim them, but to thank them. For sheltering the life I once knew. For holding the sound of his laughter. For giving me somewhere to fall when everything else collapsed. And then I left. I didn't leave out of defeat. I didn't leave because I had nowhere else to go. I left because the house no longer held anything I needed. Carlton wasn't there. He was in the letter, in the silence, in the space I carried within me that no one could take. I locked the door behind me and slipped the key through the mail slot. Not as a gesture, not as a statement, just because it was time. Some people chase justice like a storm. Loud, chaotic, leaving damage behind. I didn't want that. I wanted closure. I wanted to walk away with my head high and my heart, though cracked, still mine. That was the real goodbye. Not to Cleo. Not even to Carlton. But to the woman I used to be when this all began. The one who begged to be seen. To be remembered. To matter. She didn't need to beg anymore. I found the safe by accident. It was hidden behind a loose panel in the hallway closet, the kind of spot you only notice when you're not looking for anything at all. The combination was written in Carlton's handwriting on the back of a faded photo of the two of us at his graduation. I paused before turning the dial, already knowing that whatever was inside would not be just things. It would be him. Inside was a single envelope aged just slightly at the corners, with my name written the way only he ever wrote it. A little crooked with too much pressure on the pen. I sat down right there on the floor and opened it, letting the paper unfold itself into something bigger than just a letter. Mom, I know she will erase you. That's why I left these words where only you would find them. I read the first line again and again, until the ink began to blur. Not from the paper, from my eyes. He knew. He had seen it coming. All of it. And instead of trying to stop it with arguments or confrontation, he stopped it with love. Quietly. In his own way. He said he was sorry for not standing up for me when he should have. For letting my silence become convenient. For watching me fade into the background of his life when I was the one who had always been at the center of it. He wrote about the first time I held his hand crossing the street, about how safe he felt when I hummed in the kitchen before work, about how he once pretended to be asleep just to hear me whisper goodnight. He said those memories never left. Not even when life got loud or messy or confusing. He remembered the soup I made every time he had a cold, the way I sat beside him when he failed his first college exam, the night I pawned my engagement ring just so he wouldn't have to drop out. He wrote that back then he thought I was just doing what moms do. But now, as a man, he understood I had given up more than he ever saw. He wrote that Cleo had changed him, not by force, but by erosion. Slowly, she made him question what love should look like, what loyalty meant, what family was supposed to be. And by the time he realized too much damage had been done to make it right in front of everyone. So he made it right here, where only I would find it. You are the person I owe everything to. You are the reason I kept trying. When I had nothing, You were still there, even when I made you invisible. That line shattered something in me, not in a violent way, in a way that made room for something new. For the first time in so long, I felt seen, not by the world, but by the one person I had been holding space for all along. The letter ended simply. No dramatic closing. Just his name and a tiny drawing in the corner. A stick figure of him holding hands with a smaller one. I remembered it from a birthday card he gave me when he was 7. He had drawn us together like that back then, too. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I held it to my chest and leaned against the wall. I stayed like that for a long time, not crying, just feeling, letting the years unwind themselves around me like thread from a spool. I didn't need to tell anyone about the letter. It wasn't meant for anyone else. It wasn't proof. It was presence. It was him. In a world that had worked so hard to erase me from his life, he had left a trail only I could follow. And at the end of it, there he was. My boy. My son. Saying goodbye the only way he knew how. Softly. But forever. What I learned is that pain doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it walks in through your own front door and sits at your dinner table. It wears a familiar face, speaks in a soft voice, and still it can break your heart in ways you never expected. I used to think family was about blood, about titles, about shared names on documents. But family, I've learned, is about presence, about who shows up when everything falls apart, about who stays when there's nothing left to take. Carlton was my son, not by birth, but by bond. And even though the world around me tried to erase that connection, I never doubted it. Not for a second. Love like that doesn't ask for proof. It just is. I've carried guilt like a second skin. For not seeing the signs sooner. For staying silent too long. For letting myself believe I needed to earn my place in a home I helped build. But guilt loses its grip when grace steps in. And grace came in the form of a letter tucked away in a safe. A letter that reminded me that my love had not gone unseen. I've learned that sometimes survival looks like letting go. Not because you're weak, but because you're finally strong enough to choose peace over permission. I walked away from that house not because I had nothing to stay for, but because I had everything I needed already inside me. People talk about justice like it's a loud final moment. But the kind I found was quiet. It came in small, steady waves. In a nod from a lawyer. In a folded letter. In the silence of a house that no longer held my worth. I don't need anyone to call me mom anymore. That word doesn't hold me hostage the way it used to. What I needed was to believe I had loved well. That I had given everything I could. And that I had let go when love no longer had a place to land. I have learned that healing is not loud. It doesn't shout or announce itself. It happens when you wake up and the air feels lighter. When the past no longer whispers in your ear. When you look in the mirror and see not a victim, not a mother, not a widow, but a whole person. To anyone watching who has felt invisible in their own family, I want to say this. You are not what they call you. You are not the silence you've been forced to carry. You are what you survived. And surviving is enough. What I learned is that forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you. So you can breathe again. So you can step outside without dragging yesterday behind you. And most of all, I've learned that being erased doesn't mean you disappear. Sometimes it means you get to write your story again. From the beginning. On your own terms. With your own voice. I lived through the kind of heartbreak that doesn't make sense to most people. But I came out the other side still standing. Still soft. Still mine. And that, to me, is the truest kind of victory.